necessary to write effective, valuable, and maintainable tests for your React applications. If you have been searching for a comprehensive, easy to follow, well-organized, and practical course that takes you from zero to hero, this is the right React testing course for you. This course is packed with a ton of coding techniques I've learned over 20 years in software engineering. Plus, it's packed with numerous real-world exercises designed to help you master React testing. By the end of this course, you'll have the skills and knowledge to confidently test React applications like a pro. This expertise will set you apart in the world of software development, opening doors to exciting opportunities and challenges. It gets selected. But in a real-world application, quite often, something should happen after an item is selected. Perhaps we want to filter a list of objects, or maybe we want to redirect the user to a different page, so something should happen after an item is selected. Now, what happens is different from one application to another. There is no one-size-fits-all. So we don't want to implement that piece of logic inside our list group component, because then it's not going to be a reusable component anymore. So we need a mechanism to notify the consumer or the parent of this component that an item is selected. In this case, the consumer or the parent of this component is our app component. This is where we're using the list group. So when an item is selected, we should notify the app component that an item is selected. The parent of this component, our list group component, because then it's not going to be a reusable component anymore. So we need a mechanism to notify the consumer or the parent of this component that an item is selected. In this case, the consumer or the parent of this component is our app component. This is where we're using the list group. So when an item is selected, we should notify the app component that an item is selected. But how can we implement this? Well, that's very easy. So look at our props object. Currently, we have two properties, and we are using these to pass data to our list group component. Now we can add a third property, which is going to be a function. But how can we implement this? Well, that's very easy. So look at our props object. Currently, we have two properties, and we are using these to pass data to our list group component. Now we can add a third property, which is going to be a function. Now down here, when we select an item, we're going to call that function. With this, our app component will be notified. Let me show you how this works. It's really simple. So first, let's define the signature of that function. Let's imagine that we want a function that takes a parameter called item of type string, that is the selected item, and returns void. So it doesn't return a value. So here we add a property. By convention, we start with the word on, and then we specify the type of event. In this case, select item. This is just like the onClick prop that you saw earlier. But here we have onSelect item. So we have a property called onSelect item. The type of this property is a function that has a parameter of type string and returns void. Okay? With that, now we have a compilation error in our app component. How can I tell? Look, it turned red. Also, we can go to the top, under View, open up the Problems panel. So the TypeScript compiler is telling us that in the app component, we have forgotten to pass this prop. So once again, the TypeScript compiler is helping us catch a lot of potential problems early on. So it the parameter returns. Show you how this works. I'm going to call a function. Now down group two properties. Well, that's very easy. That an item is selected. But how can we implement this? Well, that's very easy. So look at our props object. Currently, we have two properties, and we are using these to pass data to our list group item. So look, it turned red. Also, we can go to the top, under View, open up the Problems panel. So the TypeScript compiler is telling us that in the app component, we have forgotten to pass this prop. So once again, the TypeScript compiler is helping us catch a lot of potential problems early on. So let's go back to our app component. Now here we said onSelect item. We can write an inline function here, just like how we handled the click event earlier, or we can write a separate event handler. If you want to write a separate event handler, again, just like before, by convention, we start with the word handle, And then we specify the type of event, select item. Now we set this to a function with the signature that we just defined. So item of type string goes to nothing. Now here we can just do a console.log and print the item on the console. Now we can pass that down here, handle select item. Now the last step, back to our list group. Over here, when now we can pass that down. Here, handle select item. Now the last step, back to our list group. Over here, when destructuring the props, we should pick the onSelect item property. And then when selecting an item, we should call this function. So we call this and pass the selected item, which is this item variable here. Now back to the browser. When we select an item, the app component is notified and it's now printing the name of the selected city on the console. Now let's talk about the differences and similarities between props and state. As you have seen, props or properties are the inputs or arguments passed to a component. State, on the other hand, is the internal data managed by a component that can change over time. So props are like function arguments and state is like local variables inside a function. Now, one thing you need to know about props is that we should treat them as immutable. What does this mean? In English, to mutate something means to change it. So mutable means changeable and immutable means unchangeable. So when we say something is immutable, it means it's read-only. So in our list group component, here are our props. We should not change any of them here. We should not set the heading to a new value. If we do so, nothing is going to happen. Nobody is going to yell at us, but this is an anti-pattern in React. You will understand the philosophy behind this as we go through the course. This is based on functional programming principles. So we should treat props as immutable or unchangeable. State, on the other hand, is mutable. And that's the whole purpose of using state variables. We want to tell React that this component has data that can change over time, right? So these were the differences between state and props. But one thing they both have in common is that anytime they change, React will re-render our component and update the DOM accordingly. Sometimes we want to pass children to a component, just like how we are passing a list group to this div element here. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to create a component that can accept children. So back to our components folder, let's add a new file called alert.tsx. Now let me show you a shortcut. Instead of defining a function here and then exporting it, we can use a shortcut. So here in the extensions panel, if you search for ES7 Plus, you will find this extension. It's called ES7 Plus, React, Redux, and React Native. It's a very popular extension. Look at how many times it's been downloaded. So once you install this, you can type R. IFCE. Now it's not coming up. I don't know why. So let's close this file and open it one more time. Now let's try again. Good. So this is short for React Arrow Function Component Export. So if you press enter, we get this code snippet. Lovely. Now here we have multi-cursor editing, so we can change the name of the component if we made a mistake, but in this case, no. So let's go back to alert. And then we press escape to exit multi-cursor editing. Good. Now we don't need to import React on the top. So here's our alert component. Now let's add this to our app component and test our application up to this point. So we go to the app component. Now we're done with our list group for now. So let's delete all the code here. Done with our list group for now. So let's delete all the code here. Now inside this div, we want to add an alert. So let's add alert. Good. Now back to the browser. So here's our alert component. Lovely. Now to display an alert, we're going to borrow some code from Bootstrap. So head over to Bootstrap website, go to the docs, and here on the left side, under components, you should find alerts. So let's find out the markup we need to render an alert like this. So that is very straightforward. We need a div with two classes. The base class is alert that all of these have. The second class is a class that determines the color. So if you use alert primary, we get this blue alert by default. So back to our alert component, let's give this div a couple of classes, alert and alert. Primary. All right, this is what we get. Lovely. Now we need to make this dynamic. So we want to pass the text as a prop. To do that, first we need to use an interface to define the shape of props. So props, here we need a property called text of type string. Then we add a parameter here of type props. In fact, it's better to destructure this and grab the text property and render it right here. Okay, now back.
Chill out, dude. What the fuck?
Back to our app component. Here we should set the text to something like hello world. Before going further, let's test our implementation. Okay, it's working. Lovely. Now, while this works, this way of passing text to this component is kind of ugly. What if the text is a bit too long? What if you want to pass HTML content? Passing HTML content as a prop like this is kind of ugly. Wouldn't that be nicer if you could pass text as a child to this component? Let me show you how. So we want to be able to use this component like this. This is better. So to do that, we go back to our component. Now there is a special prop that all components support, and it's called children. So if we simply rename text to children, now we can pass our text as a child to this component. But we have a couple of errors because we need to rename these two references to text. So I'm going to rename them both in one go. Good. The errors are gone and our application is still working. Lovely. Now, what if you want to pass HTML content? content here. We get a compilation error because we told the TypeScript compiler that the children prop is a string. But in this case, we are not passing a string, we are passing a more complex structure. To solve this problem, we need to change the type of children from string to React node. Now here in the auto completion box, we have two React nodes. The first one is an abbreviation. So if you press enter here, we get this markup. This is not what we want. We want the second item. This is the React node class defined in the React module. So let's import it on the top like this. And with that, we can pass HTML content to our alert component. So to recap, using the children prop, we can pass children to a component.
The fuck?
Content, we can pass children to a component. That is not what we want. We want the second item, a more complex structure. This is not what we want. Module. So let's import it on the top like this. And with that, we can pass
Go blue.
pass HTML content to our alert component. So to recap, using the children prop, we can pass children to a component. All right, the last thing we're going to cover in this section is React DevTools, which is a very useful browser extension for inspecting and analyzing our React applications. It's available for Chrome, Firefox, and Microsoft Edge. So simply Google React Developer Tools, or one is Components, the other is Profile. In the DevTools, you will see a couple of new tabs. One is Components, the other is Profiler. Now look at the Components tab. Here we can see the hierarchy of our components. So on the top, we have the app component, and below that, we have the alert component. So this is the component tree that React takes and renders in the actual DOM. Now, down here, you can see the props of this component. So here we have the children prop, which is set to an array of two objects. The first element is a string. The second element is a span object. Below that, you can see how this component was rendered. So it was rendered by the app component. Now, finally, down here, you can see where this component is implemented. In this case, in app.tsx, but that is not visible in my recording window. Now, in a large application with a lot of components, finding the right component might be a little bit tedious. So we Components tab. There's also another useful feature here. So we can select a component and click on this icon to see its source code. Don't worry about them. Don't worry about the now. Don't try to do too many things together. Now we go back to our app component, and step is done, passed from the outside. So the parent of this component is going to pass that function. We get that function and simply pass it. We have to tell the TypeScript compiler that this property is optional. So we add a question mark after, and now the error is gone. Okay? So here, compiler is alert is visible. Alert visible is true. So we wrap this in braces and perform a logical AND between alert visible and this expression. So alert visible
Let's get started with JavaScript. We're going to use the Chrome browser in this tutorial. Hello and welcome. Today And now we'll tell the slice method with its second parameter reusable and should function. And I guess the entire function, if you will, anonymous functions are now defined. And these are front name here in the email, and this will be John at Dave's Domain. And we'll use in our code block. Now we know there are the two lowercase and two uppercase methods, but JavaScript does not have a two proper case. So we'll make our own. And here we'll return, and then we'll use the name parameter that we're going to pass to the function, and we'll get the character at the 0 position, which will be the first letter of the name, and we'll set that to uppercase with the two uppercase method. And then we'll use the addition operator, and again, when we're working with strings, that should just mash together the next part, actually concatenate, if you will, the next part of the name. And so we'll use name again, and now we'll slice, but we'll not start at the 0 position, we'll start at the 1 position. So this will be slicing off that first letter that we've already set to uppercase. And now we'll call to lowercase, and this will return both of those. Once again, this is just a declaration. We have not got anything to return yet into the console window. We haven't called the function. So let's once again use the console log function just so we can see the result of our function. And here we'll call to proper case. Visual Studio Code helped me out there. And now we can put any name in here. And so let's go lowercase d, uppercase v, lowercase v. I believe I said v before. So lowercase d, uppercase a, lowercase v, uppercase e. When we call this function, we'll pass, whoop, got that in the wrong spot. We'll pass that string, and in the console, we get Dave in proper case. And once again, we could do this with anything. I guess it's September right now. Let's put in the month of September. Any string we pass to our function, it will set to proper case. So that is our introduction to functions. Functions provide reusable code. And that is the main thing to take away. We can define blocks of code and call them when we need them. Hi, I'm Dave, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Remember to keep striving for daily progress instead of perfection. Subscribe to my channel and ring the bell to be alerted. Hello and welcome. Today we are comparing the JavaScript keywords var, let, and const. And to do that, we also need to discuss the concept of scope in JavaScript. Let's get started. Today we're discussing the keywords var, let, and const. All three are used to initialize variables in JavaScript, and all of this will lead to a discussion of scope. But let's start with the keyword var, and we'll declare a variable x, then set it equal to 1. This is what was done in JavaScript from the very beginning up until 2015 when we introduced the keywords let and const. var responds a little differently, and it's not always as good. As a matter of fact, var is pretty much relegated to legacy code, which is old code at this point, in preference for let and const. And let's look at why. We can define a variable like x with the keyword var, and we can log that to the console and see the value just fine. We'll see the value over there of 1. However, var doesn't throw an error if we redeclare that same variable. And now that variable's 2. But imagine if you're working on a team or you've got different files of JavaScript that are all pulled into a project. This could get very confusing and there could be problems, especially when an error doesn't happen and you really need that error to realize that something has been defined with the same variable name. So when we use the keyword let and attempt to do this, we get an error, and that is actually desirable in this case. Now both var and let will allow reassignment. And so there is no error here because we didn't use the keyword let again. We just declared the variable once, but then we reassign the value, and that's okay. If we use the keyword const, this will throw an error. And this makes const the preference for most. You want to use const whenever you can, and then use let when you know you're going to need to reassign a value. But if you know you won't be reassigning a value, const is short for constant, a constant value, just use the keyword const. Otherwise use let and leave var for legacy code. But now we need to discuss scope and the differences, because var has a different scope, and really the way it responds to scopes is different than let and const. As we move our discussion towards scope, let's start with global scope. And with global scope, we define a variable, give it a value, and it is available everywhere. And it doesn't matter with global scope if we use var or let or even const. They're all global variables when we define them in the global scope. So all three of these variables are global variables at this point. We have not defined the opposite of a global scope, which is a local scope. Inside of a local scope, and there can be more than one type of a local scope. As a matter of fact, there's two. There's block scope, and inside of these curly braces, we can once again define, even with let or const, we can define a variable again and not get an error, as we see no error in the console. The other type I mentioned as a local scope is a function. And so for local scope, we have block scope and function scope, and they are not exclusive. We can put a block inside of a function. We can put another function inside of a function. I'll create a function now. And this scope, and I'll use const here, is also a local scope. Now when we look at local scope versus global scope, the variable we define, y for example, is not available. This value pair here, y, the variable, equals 4, is not available in the global scope. So if I comment out the y in the global scope, and then we put a console log statement in the global scope once again, and we try to log y, we should get an error. And that's right, we got a reference error, y is not defined. It is not defined in the global scope right now. It is defined in a local scope. And if we try to do the same thing inside of our local scope, we get 4 to the console. No problem. We can see the same with z. If we comment that out in the global scope, as you might expect, we will get an error, reference error. It's not defined. But if we add it to our function, and then we need to call our function, we get 4 from our block scope, and we get 5 from our function sent to the console. And let's take our local scope, that's a block scope, let's put it inside of our function. And that works too. Now when we call our function, we log the value of z, and the value is inside the scope of the function, which is also called function scope. But this is a local scope, but this is inside the function, so it's also a function scope. And this local scope, we've created another kind of environment, if you will, for a block of code with the curly braces, and this is inside the function. So let's come back up here, and instead of logging the value of z to the console, let's log the value of y. And at the same time, we'll uncomment y in the global scope. Now let's see what happens. The value of y that gets logged to the console first time is 2, and that's defined in the global scope, because the values from local scope cannot move upwards. They do not go to the parent, and this scope is nested inside of a function, so it will not move up into the function scope. It stays within